Imagine standing on a rooftop in the middle of a dying city, watching the horizon for a rescue that is 2 days too late. That is where this story ends. But to understand how a man once considered untouchable, a soldier so composed under fire that entire armies feared merely the mention of his name, found himself trapped and alone in the heart of Africa, we have to go back decades earlier, to a British officer whose reputation for fearlessness was built not on recklessness, but on an almost unnatural calm in the face of death, a man the Victorian public would come to call Chinese Gordon, and later, more tragically, Gordon of Khartoum. Charles George Gordon was born in 1833 into a military family, and like many young men of his class and era, he was shaped early by the expectation of service, training as a royal engineer before being sent into the brutal trenches of the Crimean War in the 1850s, where he first earned a reputation among fellow officers for moving through artillery fire with a steadiness that unsettled the men around him, not because he was reckless, but because he genuinely seemed unafraid. A trait that would follow him and eventually define him for the rest of his career. It was in China, however, during the chaos of the Taiping Rebellion, one of the deadliest civil conflicts in human history, that Gordon transformed from a competent officer into a legend. Placed in command of a Qing allied force known as the Ever-Victorious Army, a mixed unit of Chinese soldiers under foreign officers, Gordon proved himself a disciplined and unusually humane commander for the period, refusing looting, insisting on paying his soldiers properly, and leading assaults personally rather than from a safe distance, often carrying nothing more than a small cane instead of a weapon, a detail that became part of his growing mythology. His campaigns helped break the back of the rebellion, and by the time he returned to Britain, the press had already given him the nickname that would follow him home: Chinese Gordon, the soldier who could not be frightened. But reputation, however earned, does not always translate cleanly into political judgment, and this is where Gordon's story begins to shift from triumph toward tragedy. After years of assignments across the British Empire, including a period spent working on Danube boundary commissions and later serving in Egyptian-controlled territories, Gordon was appointed Governor-General of the Sudan in the 1870s under the authority of the Egyptian Khedive, a role that placed him in direct control of a vast, difficult region stretching along the Nile into the heart of Africa. During this period, Gordon worked to suppress the slave trade that had long devastated the region, an effort that earned him admiration in Britain, but also made him deeply unpopular among powerful local slave-trading networks, and it exposed him firsthand to the immense administrative and military challenges of governing Sudan, a territory too large, too diverse, and too poorly connected to Cairo to be controlled easily by any single authority. By the early 1880s, Egyptian rule over Sudan, itself only nominally independent and increasingly influenced by British financial and political interests following Egypt's debt crisis, had become deeply resented by much of the Sudanese population, who viewed Egyptian administrators as corrupt, exploitative, and religiously compromised. Into this volatile atmosphere emerged Mohammed Ahmed, a religious leader who in 1881 declared himself the Mahdi, a redeemer figure in Islamic eschatology, and called for a holy war against Egyptian rule, and by extension, the foreign influence propping it up. What followed was not a minor uprising, but a rapid, sweeping movement that gathered enormous popular support across Sudan, fueled by genuine religious conviction, resentment of foreign taxation, and anger at the slave trade suppression policies that had disrupted powerful local economic networks. Egyptian and British-led garrison forces sent to crush the rebellion suffered catastrophic defeats, most notably the destruction of an entire Egyptian army under British officer William Hicks in November 1883, a disaster that eliminated nearly 10,000 men and shocked observers in both Cairo and London, making clear that the modest movement was not a passing disturbance, but a serious and highly organized force capable of overwhelming conventional armies. Faced with this reality, the British government, led by Prime Minister William Gladstone, made a fateful decision not to reinforce Sudan and hold it, but to abandon it, ordering the evacuation of Egyptian garrisons and civilians scattered across the region, rather than commit British troops and resources to a prolonged colonial war that Gladstone's government had little appetite for, both financially and politically, given his broader reluctance toward imperial overextension. To carry out this evacuation, someone with credibility, courage, and first-hand knowledge of Sudan was needed. Someone who could organize the safe withdrawal of thousands of people from a collapsing territory under threat of an advancing religious army. And the name that rose immediately to the top of every list was Charles Gordon, the fearless, famous, deeply respected former Governor-General who understood the region better than almost any other British official alive. In January 1884, Gordon was dispatched to Khartoum, the administrative capital of Sudan, situated at the strategic confluence of the Blue and White Nile rivers, with instructions that historians have long debated in terms of their precise scope, but which centered broadly on reporting on the situation and facilitating the evacuation of Egyptian forces and foreign nationals from the city and surrounding garrisons. It is here, in the interpretation of those instructions, that the seeds of the tragedy to come were planted. Gordon arrived in Khartoum to a hero's welcome, greeted by crowds who remembered his earlier, more benevolent governorship, and he initially began organizing the departure of civilians, sending convoys of women, children, and wounded soldiers down the Nile toward Egyptian-held territory whenever the routes remained open. But as the modest forces tightened their grip around the region, cutting telegraph lines and closing escape routes, Gordon increasingly came to believe that a full evacuation was no longer practically achievable. And more importantly, he became convinced that abandoning Khartoum entirely would not only strand the remaining population to slaughter or enslavement, but would also represent a moral and strategic failure that Britain could not honorably accept. A conviction rooted partly in his genuine humanitarian concern for those who could not be evacuated in time, and partly in his own deeply held religious and moral worldview, which framed his mission in Sudan as something closer to a sacred duty than a bureaucratic assignment. Rather than continuing the withdrawal, Gordon made the decision that would define the rest of his life. He chose to stay, to fortify Khartoum, and to hold the city, believing that his presence alone might stabilize the situation, and that London, once it understood the stakes, would eventually send reinforcements or a relief force to support him. This is the mistake at the heart of this story, though calling it a single mistake somewhat oversimplifies a much more complicated reality, because Gordon's decision was not born of arrogance or carelessness, but of a specific combination of humanitarian conviction, religious certainty, and a fundamental miscalculation about how quickly, or whether at all, his own government would act to support him, once he committed to holding the city rather than evacuating it as originally instructed. Historians have long debated whether Gordon exceeded his authority or was acting within a reasonable interpretation of ambiguous instructions, and this remains a genuinely contested question rather than a settled one. But what is not disputed is the practical outcome. Gordon effectively trapped himself and the roughly 7,000 remaining soldiers and 30,000 civilians inside Khartoum, betting his life and theirs on the assumption that Britain would not allow its most famous soldier to be abandoned to a besieging army. Back in London, this bet proved far shakier than Gordon anticipated. Gladstone's government, already reluctant to involve Britain in a costly Sudanese campaign, was slow to authorize a relief expedition, hesitating for months even as newspaper coverage of Gordon's situation grew increasingly urgent and public sympathy for the besieged general intensified across Britain, creating a political crisis that would eventually threaten Gladstone's own position in government. Meanwhile, in Khartoum, Gordon organized the city's defenses with the same discipline and ingenuity that had made his reputation in China, strengthening fortifications, deploying what limited artillery and ammunition he had, mining approaches to the city, and using a small fleet of armed steamers on the Nile to patrol the river and disrupt modest movements. All while sending increasingly urgent messages, downriver pleading for reinforcement and warning that the city could not hold indefinitely without support. For months, against considerable odds, Gordon's improvised defenses held, and the siege dragged on through the searing heat of a Sudanese year, with the city's food supplies steadily dwindling, its garrison thinning through combat losses and disease, and its civilian population enduring conditions that grew more desperate with each passing week, even as Gordon continued directing the defense with what observers described as remarkable composure, refusing to abandon the population he had chosen to protect. Only in the late summer of 1884, many months after Gordon's initial pleas, did the British government finally authorize a relief expedition under General Garnet Wolseley, a highly regarded commander tasked with organizing a rescue mission up the Nile. But the logistics of moving a British force through hundreds of miles of difficult desert and river terrain, including a series of dangerous cataracts along the Nile that required specially designed boats and enormous manpower to navigate, meant that the expedition moved with agonizing slowness, a delay that would prove fatal. As 1884 turned into 1885, conditions inside Khartoum deteriorated sharply, food supplies nearly exhausted, morale among the remaining defenders crumbling under the weight of prolonged deprivation, and the surrounding modest forces, now numbering in the tens of thousands, tightening their siege lines in preparation for a final assault, sensing correctly that the city's defenders were approaching the limits of their endurance. In the early hours of January 26, 1885, modest forces launched their final assault on Khartoum, breaching the city's weakened defenses after the Nile's seasonal low water levels had exposed sections of the riverside fortifications that Gordon's garrison could no longer adequately defend. And in the chaotic fighting that followed, General Charles Gordon was killed. The precise circumstances of his death recorded through second-hand and sometimes conflicting accounts from survivors and modest sources, though the broadly accepted narrative holds that he died fighting near the governor's palace rather than surrendering. Just 2 days later, on January 28, 1885, the lead elements of Wolseley's long-delayed relief expedition finally arrived within sight of Khartoum, only to find the modest flag flying over a city that had already fallen, the rescue mission arriving mere hours too late to save the man it had been sent to save. A timing so narrow and so cruel that it became one of the most agonizing near misses in the history of British military history. The news of Gordon's death, when it reached Britain weeks later, triggered a wave of public grief and outrage unlike almost anything seen in the Victorian era, transforming Gordon overnight from a respected soldier into a national martyr, his image reproduced in paintings, poems, and popular literature that emphasized his heroism, and framed his death as a consequence of governmental failure rather than his own decision to remain in the city, and Prime Minister Gladstone, already politically vulnerable, faced fierce public criticism for the months of delay in authorizing and executing the relief expedition, with critics bitterly reworking his famous nickname, the Grand Old Man, into a far less flattering label tied directly to Gordon's fate. The fall of Khartoum also marked a broader strategic turning point, as Sudan effectively passed out of Egyptian and British control entirely, with the modest movement establishing an independent Islamic state that would govern much of the region for over a decade. A state that continued under the Mahdi's successor after Mohammed Ahmed's death from illness only months after his forces captured Khartoum. It would not be until 1898, more than 13 years later, that a British and Egyptian force under General Herbert Kitchener would return to Sudan and decisively defeat modest forces at the Battle of Omdurman, effectively reconquering the territory in a campaign that was explicitly framed in British public memory as a long-delayed reckoning for Gordon's death, demonstrating just how deeply the events at Khartoum had embedded themselves into British imperial identity and justification for renewed intervention in the region. Looking back across this entire episode, what makes Gordon's story so enduringly compelling is not simply the drama of a siege or the tragedy of a rescue arriving too late, but the deeper human questions sitting at its center. The question of what happens when personal conviction, however genuinely and honorably held, collides with the slower, more cautious machinery of government policy, and when a single individual's decision to prioritize moral duty over strict obedience to orders sets in motion consequences far beyond what that individual could control. Gordon's fatal choice to remain in Khartoum rather than complete the evacuation he had been sent to oversee, was not born of vanity or a desire for glory, but from a genuine and deeply human belief that abandoning the people of that city would have been a betrayal he could not live with. And in that sense, his story remains a powerful and sobering reminder that courage and moral clarity, even when admirable, do not guarantee a favorable outcome, and that the space between a soldier's convictions and his government's willingness to back them can sometimes prove the most dangerous ground of all. To fully appreciate how extraordinary Gordon's reputation was before Khartoum, it helps to look more closely at the years that built it, because very few Victorian officers earned the kind of near-mythical status that surrounded his name by the 1870s. His early service as a royal engineer exposed him to the grim realities of siege warfare during the Crimean Campaign, where he took part in operations around Sevastopol, learning firsthand the value of fortification, patience, and precise engineering under fire, lessons that would later prove directly relevant to his own defense of Khartoum decades afterward. It was his time in China, however, that truly transformed him into a public figure. The Taiping Rebellion, which raged through much of the mid-19th century, was staggering in scale, resulting in a death toll that some historians estimate reached into the tens of millions when combined with the famine and disease that accompanied the fighting, making it one of the deadliest conflicts of the entire century, far exceeding many of the wars more commonly remembered in Western history books. Against this catastrophic backdrop, Gordon's leadership of the ever-victorious army stood out precisely because of his restraint as much as his aggression, since he built a reputation for discipline in an environment where looting, extortion, and brutality by irregular forces were common, insisting instead on regular pay and organized conduct among his troops. A policy that made his units more effective in the long run, because local populations were less inclined to resist or sabotage forces that did not automatically terrorize them. His habit of leading from the front, often unarmed except for a small rattan cane that soldiers on both sides came to recognize, fed directly into the growing legend of a man who seemed almost supernaturally unconcerned with his own safety. And by the time he returned to Britain in the mid-1860s, he was already a minor celebrity, though one who remained personally modest and reportedly uncomfortable with excessive public attention, a trait that only added to his mystique. His later work in Sudan during his first governorship in the 1870s deepened both his knowledge of the region and his reputation as a humanitarian reformer, since his efforts against the entrenched slave trade networks operating along the Nile and its tributaries brought him into direct conflict with powerful merchants and local power brokers who had profited enormously from human trafficking for generations. And while his campaigns were only partially successful in permanently disrupting these networks, they were significant enough to generate lasting resentment among groups whose economic interests he had threatened, resentment that would later feed into the broader coalition of grievances the Mahdist movement was able to draw upon. Understanding the rise of the Mahdist movement itself requires looking beyond religious fervor alone, because while Muhammad Ahmad's declaration of himself as the Mahdi in 1881 carried immense religious weight within an Islamic eschatological framework that anticipated a divinely guided figure who would purify the faith and restore justice, the movement's rapid growth was equally fueled by very concrete grievances, including heavy taxation imposed by Egyptian administrators. Deep resentment of foreign Turkish and Egyptian officials, seen as corrupt and religiously compromised, and widespread anger among slave-trading communities, whose livelihoods had been disrupted by earlier suppression efforts, meaning the uprising drew support from an unusually broad coalition that included both devout religious followers and groups with more material and economic motivations for rebellion. The catastrophic destruction of William Hicks's expedition in November 1883 cannot be overstated in its importance to the unfolding crisis, because this was not a minor skirmish, but the near-total annihilation of a 10,000-man Egyptian force in the desert near El Obeid, a defeat so complete that it effectively erased Egypt's capacity to project military power into the Sudanese interior and left the scattered garrisons across the region, including Khartoum itself, dangerously isolated with no realistic prospect of reinforcement from Cairo, which is precisely why the British government concluded that evacuation rather than reinforcement was the only remaining option. When Gordon arrived back in Khartoum in February 1884, the scene that greeted him revealed just how quickly the situation had deteriorated since his earlier governorship. With communication lines to the outside world increasingly fragile, refugee populations from outlying regions streaming into the city seeking safety, and modest forces steadily encircling the region from multiple directions, cutting off the overland routes that might otherwise have allowed a more orderly and complete evacuation before the noose fully tightened. During the early months of his mission, Gordon did manage to organize the departure of several thousand people, including women, children, and wounded soldiers, sending them downriver on steamers while conditions still allowed relatively safe passage. And it is worth remembering this often overlooked chapter of the story, because it demonstrates that Gordon did initially attempt to fulfill something close to his original evacuation mandate before circumstances, and his own evolving judgment led him toward the decision to remain and defend the city instead. As the siege tightened through the spring and summer of 1884, Gordon's defensive preparations reflected the same engineering discipline that had marked his earlier career. As he organized the digging of trenches, the emplacement of what limited cannon he possessed, the laying of land mines around vulnerable approaches to the city, and the deployment of a small improvised flotilla of armored river steamers that patrolled the Nile and provided both reconnaissance and fire support against modest positions along the riverbanks, innovations that allowed a garrison of only a few thousand soldiers, many of them irregular or poorly equipped, to hold off a besieging force that eventually numbered in the tens of thousands. Life inside besieged Khartoum grew progressively harder as the months wore on, with food stores dwindling steadily despite strict rationing measures Gordon imposed, disease spreading through the crowded and increasingly unsanitary conditions within the city walls, and the psychological strain of prolonged uncertainty weighing heavily on both soldiers and civilians who had no way of knowing whether help would ever arrive in time. A strain reflected in the increasingly urgent tone of the messages Gordon continued smuggling downriver to British authorities in Cairo and London, warning with growing precision about how long the city's supplies and morale could realistically hold. The political drama unfolding simultaneously in London deserves attention as well, because Gladstone's government found itself caught between genuine reluctance to commit British resources and lives to a costly Sudanese campaign it had never wanted, and mounting public and parliamentary pressure fueled by newspaper correspondents whose dispatches kept Gordon's plight in front of the British public for months, creating a slow-building political crisis that eventually forced the government's hand, though far later than circumstances ultimately allowed. When the relief expedition under Garnet Wolseley finally received authorization in the late summer of 1884, its planners faced a genuinely difficult logistical problem, since moving a substantial military force hundreds of miles up the Nile required navigating a series of dangerous cataracts, stretches of the river broken by rocks and rapids that made conventional river transport impossible, forcing the expedition to rely on specially designed small boats crewed partly by Canadian voyageurs recruited specifically for their river navigation expertise, alongside a desert column that attempted a more direct overland route across a punishing stretch of terrain in hopes of reaching Khartoum faster than the river-bound main force. Despite these efforts, the sheer scale of the logistical challenge, combined with the months lost to the initial political hesitation in London, meant the expedition simply could not move quickly enough to outrace the collapsing situation inside Khartoum. And this narrow, agonizing margin between rescue and disaster remains one of the most studied and debated near misses in British military history, prompting generations of historians to examine whether earlier authorization, faster logistics, or different strategic choices might have changed the outcome, though such questions remain matters of historical interpretation rather than settled fact. The fall of the city on January 26, 1885, and Gordon's death during the final assault sent shockwaves through Victorian Britain that extended well beyond simple mourning for a single soldier, reshaping public attitudes toward imperial commitments, fueling intense debate in Parliament about governmental accountability, and contributing directly to the eventual collapse of Gladstone's government the following year. A political consequence that illustrates just how deeply this distant colonial tragedy reverberated through domestic British politics. In the decades that followed, Gordon's death became deeply embedded in British imperial memory, invoked repeatedly as justification for renewed intervention in Sudan, culminating in Kitchener's campaign of 1898 and the decisive engagement at Omdurman, where a modern British and Egyptian force equipped with superior firepower defeated modest forces in a battle that, whatever its immediate military logic, was consistently framed in British public discourse as a long-overdue reckoning for events at Khartoum 13 years earlier. Yet beyond the political and military consequences, Gordon's story endures because of what it reveals about the intersection of individual conscience and institutional power. Since his decision to remain in Khartoum rather than complete an orderly withdrawal reflected a conviction that no government policy should require abandoning tens of thousands of people to almost certain danger. Even as that same conviction placed him and everyone who remained with him at the mercy of a government whose support arrived only after prolonged hesitation. And it is this tension between personal moral responsibility and the slower, more cautious calculations of state power that continues to make Gordon's story resonate with audiences long after the specific political circumstances of 19th-century Sudan have faded from public memory, leaving behind a question that applies far beyond any single battlefield or century, about what individuals owe to the people who depend on them, and what governments owe to the individuals they send into danger on their behalf.